Crude and refined opium is brought in from producer countries. But pure opium is seldom used today. It is converted into other drugs in secret factories. The big demand is for these derivatives of opium, the narcotic drugs, useful in medicine to relieve pain and to induce sleep. Used without supervision, they can become dangerous, habit-forming drugs.
Hello, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce, and this is the Dr. Junkie Show. And today's episode is about heroin, probably my favorite drug. But before that, I've been thinking a lot about this project, the Dr. Junkie Show, and about the future. As most listeners know, I've been teaching college classes inside Colorado prisons for the last 2 years. And our first group of students just graduated in late 2022. During that time, some of them have already been released. And my heart is in that place. I guess in a lot of ways, once you've been to prison, part of you never leaves. I've been thinking a lot about how to incorporate the stories and knowledge locked up in prison into my love of podcasting. Now, there's a lot of barriers, the biggest being that I can't just start putting people on podcasts without a ton of permission, which the DOC hasn't been real excited about offering yet. So no announcement as of right now. But stay tuned. My goal with this podcast, and with all of my work, has always been restoration. People in prison are just like you and me. Most of us have done something that might well have landed us there if things had gone just a little bit differently. If we really want to reduce incarceration and the crime that leads to it, we just need to make sure that those people understand their role in the larger social network, in culture. And to do that, we need to make sure that they all have a role to play. But in the United States, that's often a problem. We're self-centered as a rule, so problems that don't directly impact us tend to be given far less attention than those that are close to home. Which brings me to heroin.
More than 107,000 Americans died of drug overdoses in 2021. That's the highest annual death toll ever recorded, and a 15% increase from the year before.
Last year, the United States attributed almost 110,000 deaths to drug overdose. And most of those had to do with opioids, mainly fentanyls. The cruel irony is that few people would use fentanyls if the war on drugs wasn't a permanent thing in the United States. Heroin is a similar drug, and it's really cheap to produce naturally. It comes from simple poppies. It's also pretty rare to accidentally overdose on heroin if you've been using it for a long time. But since it's illegal, the cheap price of production doesn't matter as much as the price of distribution through illegal networks with underworld connections. It might be less than $2,000 for a kilogram of processed heroin in Afghanistan or in parts of South America, but it sometimes goes for as much as $500 per gram by the time it hits the streets of the United States. It's bulky, from poppy to paste to powder, and it's illegal the entire way. Plus, it takes months to produce a crop of poppies big enough to harvest and process. Because of all these issues, which are all made worse by the war on drugs, both users and dealers are always in the market for a drug that's cheaper, more compact, and easier to manufacture. This is known as the Iron Law of Prohibition. Anytime a substance is illegal, the most common form of it will be the most potent form of it. Fentanyl is the result of the Iron Law of Prohibition. It's 50 times more potent than pure heroin, and hundreds of times more potent than the diluted products usually sold on the street as heroin. It's easier to ship, not only in the form of fentanyls, but also legally in the form of precursor chemicals purchased from reputable dealers. So drug dealers don't have to spend months growing fields of poppies anymore. Plus, fentanyls are easy to cut into weak heroin to make a small amount of it larger and more potent. Although nowadays, many daily users have caught on, and they prefer to just buy fentanyls so they know what they're getting. We've moved away from heroin altogether. But there's a few problems with fentanyls, at least if you're using them in a non-medical setting. Unlike heroin, which stays in a user's system for something like a few hours, fentanyl and its cousin chemicals have super short half-lives. Our bodies metabolize them really fast. That's actually the reason that they're so popular in medicine. They allow hospitals to do procedures that require heavy sedation, but then to be able to test the pain of patients just a short time after they pull the IV needle. And if all's well, to send them home instead of keeping them overnight. A money saver. A kilogram of heroin goes for around $80,000 in the United States, wholesale. Then it gets stepped on and broken down into street-level batches, and the value might become 10 times that amount. But a kilogram of pure fentanyl can be purchased for less than $5,000, then added to heroin along with other cutting agents to turn 1 kilogram into 10 or more. So all that said, here's the sad irony of the current overdose epidemic. Most opioid users who have used heroin and fentanyl prefer heroin. It's a better, headier buzz, it lasts longer, it's a lot safer to use. But since it's expensive and it's often weak from dealers cutting it, fentanyl has become this logical choice. And again, nowadays, it's actually pretty hard to find pure heroin anywhere in the United States. If you do buy heroin, it's likely to be less than 10% heroin and laced with fentanyl to kick up the potency. Drug dealing in any illegal market is kind of like being a baker. You can tinker with your recipe until you hit the perfect mix. And that's why this problem will continue to get worse as time goes by, and as long as the war on drugs continues. Sending in a heroin sample to a harm reduction testing site used to show mostly heroin with a few cutting agents like baking soda or baby formula. But nowadays, the scanners show upwards of dozens of chemicals in most samples, everything from tramadol to xylazine to all sorts of different forms of fentanyls, plus often a touch of heroin or morphine. All of that would end the second drugs could be sold by reputable pharmacists. Walmart has never laced my Vicodin with fentanyl. In fact, capitalism incentivizes them to do the opposite of what it incentivizes illegal drug dealers to do. A legal market isn't a free-for-all, by the way. Your kids won't be able to just walk into a heroin store and order a few packs. I've linked my recent articles about what a legal market would look like in the episode description, so feel free to check that out. But in short, the culture we currently live in ensures that anytime someone decides they want to go get some cocaine or some heroin or some meth or any other drug, regardless of the legality, they can probably find it. It'll come from an untrustworthy source. It will be marked up by upwards of 1,000%. It will be poorly packaged, or maybe not packaged at all. And it'll almost certainly be contaminated by chemicals that you don't think you're buying. Plus, you might wind up in jail or prison just for buying it. A legal market would just make sure that nobody ever goes to jail for using drugs, and that no one ever has to resort to buying them from an underworld dealer. Instead, we'd buy our drugs from our therapists, counselors, doctors, pharmacists, fellow users, support networks, people that care about us. And those people would often offer us things that our dealers won't. Things like treatment, counseling, medical care, psychological medicine, group sessions, therapy, replacement medications like methadone or buprenorphine. A trip to the drug house would suddenly become an opportunity for growth, instead of a dangerous daily necessity for many addicted people. I'll leave you to read my article or to listen to the prior podcast I did about a legal market, episode 102, if you want to learn more about what that sort of world would look like. But today's episode is about just one of those drugs, heroin. But that actually means it's also about a lot of those drugs, because heroin is an opioid, or more specifically, an opiate, since it's actually made from poppies. And to understand why all of these drugs, called opioids, work the way they do in a drug war market, it's worth reviewing a few of the things about how these drugs work in the body. Opioids are all chemicals that fit into a specific receptor site on the neurons in our brains and bodies. Fentanyl, heroin, morphine, oxycodone, codeine, hydrocodone, and lots of other drugs all fit into that receptor site. But those drugs aren't the only place that opioids come from. Our bodies actually produce quite a few natural opioids. We call them endorphins or enkephalins. These chemicals bind to the same receptor sites in the brain and body as pain pills or as heroin. Now, they aren't exact fits to these receptor sites, but they're close enough to the same shape that they can slide in and dock there, sometimes for a split second, like with morphine or heroin, and sometimes for hours, like with methadone. But once they're there, they cause all sorts of biological responses. That's why all opioids have a lot in common, while also having characteristics unique to each of them. They're all slightly different shaped, slightly different sized, slightly different binding potential, slightly different half-lives, so they all act just a little bit different. They have an identity. Now, humans have at least 4 opioid receptor types found throughout our bodies, but mu receptor sites are where the magic of opioids really happens. Mu receptor sites are found primarily in the brainstem, the part of the brain that handles automatic biological functions, in the medial thalamus, the hub that connects different parts of the brain to each other. Again, there's some clues here as to why opioids work so well, but already we're heading into a world of neurology, and I'm not a neurologist. This is not a medical advice podcast, and I am not a medical doctor. So let's make sure we're all on the same page with a simple, and I mean simple, definition of how brains work. In a basic model of the human brain, we all have wires called neurons, twisted and spiraling in a massive web of connections that makes us who we are. Your memory of that thing that happened to you as a kid, or your 13th birthday party, or the things that come to mind when you smell oatmeal raisin cookies, or the memory of what you had for breakfast this morning, they're all unique webs of neurons firing in a specific order. That's all being human is. If you're religious and you're waiting for me to add the mysterious soul to this equation, you'll be waiting for a long time, because it ain't there. We are our brains, as neurologist D. Swab's book by the same name explains. Anything that feels like a memory, a feeling, an intuition, a state of mind, it's simply a pattern of neurons firing in a specific sequence. If you were an evil neuroscientist with vile intentions, you could literally remove parts of someone's brain and take away the memories that were stored there. Your soul is just who you are in the moment. The current, always changing, always updating patterns of neuroactivity unique to each of us. The average human brain has around 86 billion of these individual neurons, and each of them has, on average, around 10,000 dendrites, or branches like a tree that reach out and connect to other neurons. That's more possible connections to be made in your brain than there are stars in the entire universe, as Timothy Leary was fond of saying. But where these neural branches end, the signals they're carrying continue. Branches don't actually touch each other, but they do get really close. That small space between neurons is called a synapse, and a lot happens there. Messages are passed from one neuron to the next, often through the release of specific neurotransmitters. Some of these neurotransmitters make neurons more likely to fire, more likely to pass the message on, and some of them make neurons less likely to fire. If you were to dump a dose of a chemical into the brain that either increased or decreased the likelihood of neurons firing, you'd have a drug. As Dr. Judy Grizzle said in her book, Never Enough, drugs don't do anything in our bodies that isn't happening already. They simply speed up or slow down processes that are happening all the time. They make some of the patterns that are you fire faster or slower compared to others, effectively changing your experience of being alive. Now, even though this sounds like a super complicated process, neurons send and receive these messages really fast. It happens in a fraction of a second, thousands of times every day with some neurons. The neurotransmitter passes through the synapse and sticks to the new neural ending, and it makes the new neuron either more or less likely to fire and to pass the message on. Now, helping us keep this explanation super simple, most neurons specialize in just a single type of neurotransmitter, although a few do use more than one. Our twisting web of neural connections, it's how we communicate messages, how we think thoughts, how we remember things from the past, experience pain, understand what's going on, connect new events to past experiences, predict the future, perform complicated tasks, or move around our environment. So in this super simplified model of you, Pain messages aren't any different than memories. In the same way we conjure up images and memories from our childhood by firing a unique web of neurons that are that memory, the body also processes other messages and information, like pain. When we get hurt, pain messages travel up to the brain from the body. They ascend using a pathway called the ascending pathway. When you burn your fingertip, the messengers fire up. A long line of neurons stretching from your fingertip to your brainstem through your spinal cord begins transmitting the message to the brain, ouch. Now the ascending pathway comes through the body to the thalamus, a region of the brain that acts like a switchboard for sensation, passing those messages on to other regions related to your specific memories, your specific understanding of the world. I cut my fingertip off with a lawnmower when I was 12 years old. So anytime my thalamus receives a message of sharp pain in one of my fingertips, my reaction is probably quite a bit more intense than yours. We are our brains. Just like with my missing fingertip though, when all goes well, we rapidly process sensations based on whether or not we felt them before and whether or not we remember them as a massive threat or as a small nuisance. When you kick a table leg as you walk by, you might sense the injury before you actually feel it. You see and hear it before you actually receive the pain signal to your brain because that signal has to travel up your body and then be processed. In the meantime, usually only a few milliseconds, we evaluate how hard we kicked it, how much it will probably hurt, how concerned we should be about this injury. Are we already suffering with a broken toe that makes this table kick a big deal? Or can we just keep going on with our day? Then the pain message shows up. All that other evaluating decides what sorts of message the brain will send back. With my finger, the immediate trauma-informed, "Oh fuck, not another finger amputation," is typically updated really fast with a cognitive evaluation of the event that overrides my freak-out and registers the pain is much more manageable and basic, is no big deal. Most of us have stubbed our toes plenty of times in the past, so we usually do the same thing in that situation and downgrade the pain with a yeah, everything's fine response as soon as we consciously recognize that the injury isn't all that bad. Something called the descending pathway can then send a message back down the body. And when this happens, things get interesting. When you kick that table and the pain messages start flowing upward, you might immediately sit down and start rubbing your toe to alleviate the pain. Your rubbing will actually activate something called gateway neurons that are located just a short distance away from the injury, on the way to the spinal cord. And those gateway neurons will release chemicals that reduce the likelihood of the pain signal neuron continuing to fire. They interrupt the message. So that pain might still fire from your toe onto the next neuron, but it's shut down there. It can't go any further. In that tiny space of the synapse where the two neurons meet, the message of, "Ouch, our toe hurts," is chemically deactivated before it can be passed on to the next neuron and up the line to the brain. The chemical responsible for the shutting down of ascending pathways, it's an endorphin, an opioid that binds to the mu receptor site and starts a whole new wave of functions that shuts down the pain signal before it ever reaches the brain. That's why we feel a natural inclination to rub our heads when we hit them on something, or to rub any injury that hurts. We're literally seeking opioids for pain relief, but we're seeking them in a specific region of the body and in a really small dose. Of course, when we take a dose of heroin or a Vicodin pill, we basically flood all of our mu receptors equally instead of just the ones responsible for downgrading or interrupting a specific pain signal. Now, we don't fully understand how pain works in the body or how much of anything works in the body, but as best as we can tell, those gateway neurons that dump endorphins on our pain signals before they can make their way to the brain, those are the same neurons that are activated by the descending pathway once our brain evaluates an injury and decides that everything's fine, that your toe kick is no big deal. Your body uses opioids called endorphins to shut down that signal before it ever reaches the brain. And while you might not be able to just turn the descending pathway on whenever you want your back pain to go away, at least not without a ton of practice in the art of mindfulness, you can activate those same processes unconsciously. In fact, we do it every day. That's what being alive is. Normally, we're in the dark about the majority of what happens in our brains and our bodies. The more automatic and unconscious everything is, like heartbeat and digestion, the more attention we can turn to the more evolutionarily relevant concerns around us, like finding a mate or outrunning a predator. Evolutionary theory reminds us that we are the descendants of those who survived long enough to reproduce. And for much of human history, that meant ignoring everything that wasn't important to your survival and reproduction. So most of what happens with these pain message systems, from the head rubbing to the toe kick evaluating, it's all unconscious. That's worth remembering as we move from the basic pain signals into other actions of opioids in the body. Opioids do a lot more than just relieve pain. They also work on a portion of the brain known as the mesolimbic reward pathway, which is actively involved in motivation, addiction, and the good feelings we get from things like sex or from food. Dopamine plays a big role here, but not just in the way we often think, with reward. Dopamine isn't just a feel-good chemical, it's also, more importantly, a motivational chemical. It doesn't just make us feel like we completed a fulfilling task, so much as it makes us want to get up and go do a fulfilling task. Now, the main purpose of this portion of our brain is to mark memories as good, and to remind us that whatever we just experienced is worth experiencing again in the future. We're motivated to repeat the behavior. It doesn't matter what you just did. If your mesolimbic reward pathway rewards you for it, you'll want to do it again. And this rewarding has to happen really fast, because that's how brains really get hooked on something. When we can move rapidly from any old state of blasé into pure euphoria, we love it. That's why smoking crack or shooting heroin both tend to be harder to quit than using other forms of the same drugs. The rapid onset is part of the draw. We've evolved so that the pleasure centers in our brains are always trying to fire, like a car that you leave in gear with an engine running. But we have neurons that act as a constant brake to prevent those pleasure circuits from firing all the time. That means as soon as we turn those brakes off, the mesolimbic reward pathway is fired up and ready to go, really fast. Opioids are depressants. They reduce neural activity, like turning off those brakes on the reward system, and like the descending pathway turning off the pain signal before it reaches the brain. They do this everywhere, but it's much more pronounced in some parts of the brain and body than in others, parts of the brain and body with lots of those mu receptors. Unlike stimulants like cocaine or methamphetamine, which only cause so-called psychological dependence, depressants like alcohol, benzodiazepines, barbiturates, or opioids like heroin, codeine, oxycontin, or fentanyl, they all cause physical dependence with long-term use because they're all down regulators. They reduce the firing of many neurons. The reason is something called tolerance, which I talk about a lot on this show. Neurons respond to a number of chemicals with increased or with decreased activity. Some of those chemicals reduce the likelihood of neurons firing. Opioids work to cause the release of a few of these. And other chemicals increase the likelihood of neurons firing. Meth and cocaine work to cause the release of some of these. Tolerance is about the body's reaction when either one of these things keeps happening. If, for example, your body notices that reward pathway lighting up far too often, it'll increase the chemicals in charge of pumping the brakes to keep it from happening. If your body notices the neurotransmitter responsible for our normal states of anxiety are lowered for a long time, it naturally responds by upping the production of those chemicals. And if we keep using depressants long enough, the body's adjustments are such that we'll notice an incredible loss of effectiveness in whatever the drug is that we've been taking. We won't be able to get as high as we once could. That's the body's way of both keeping us on alert and protecting us from overdose. But it's awful news when we stop using cold turkey, because those chemicals, which have been increased in response to our use of a substance that knocks a lot of them out of service, our levels shoot way up when we stop taking the drug. With some depressants, like alcohol, this can actually be fatal, although with opioids, it's usually just hellish. With uppers like meth and cocaine, on the other hand, tolerance has lowered our production of anxiety chemicals to respond to what it sees as an overproduction. So quitting those drugs usually results in more depression and lack of motivation than in anxiety and physical discomfort. As just one example, the amygdala is a region of the brain that's responsible for fight or flight responses. When it kicks into gear, our pupils dilate, our heart rate and blood pressure increase, and we start sweating. When we use opioids for a long time, we turn down the activity of the amygdala. That's why we feel so calm. But with long-term use, our bodies respond by adjusting for what they see as a lack of go juice in the amygdala. And then in opioid withdrawal, the amygdala is, of course, one of the brain areas that remains constantly overactive. We kind of stay stuck in fight or flight. I went a lot deeper into these basic actions of opioids in an early episode. And again, I'm not a doctor or a neurologist, so I'll stay in my lane on this one, because I want to head back to our original topic, heroin and its new bedfellow, fentanyls. And hopefully I can now summarize the current issues with a few basic points that make clear that the war on drugs is responsible for where we're currently at and for where we'll wind up if we don't change something soon. First, when you replace a drug with a more potent form of that drug, like happened on the streets with fentanyls replacing heroin and Oxycontin, you drive that tolerance circuitry to a new level. The body ups its production of all sorts of anxiety-causing chemicals in response to fentanyl's disabling of the reward center's brakes in the amygdala's fear circuits. So when daily users run out of fentanyls, they suffer worse detox than they would if they were only using heroin. Detox drives us to desperate acts, from petty theft to unsafe use. In a regulated market, nobody would suffer detox. Cheap drugs like methadone can prevent it for up to 72 hours with a single oral dose that doesn't even get users high. Second, because of how opioids work in the body, they basically make many neurons much less likely to fire. The increased potency of fentanyls is a big part of the reason that overdoses have been increasing so much in recent years. In the brainstem, high doses of opioids can turn off the auto-fire program for our breathing, the system that keeps us alive while we sleep. Along with the shorter half-life of fentanyls compared to heroin, which means users have to redose more often, and the general preference for heroin most users have when they're not forced to consider price or availability, the laws have made the problem far worse than it was by incentivizing both dealers and users to switch to fentanyls regardless of their dangers. Third, back to the idea of a regulated, decriminalized market. The goal of drug treatment should be to minimize drug treatment. If a user wants to change something about their life, they should have access to the tools that they'll need, all the therapy, counseling, medicine, and support required. But one of the few things that the last century of warring against drugs has taught us is that you can't treat addiction. It's just a part of who we are as humans. I mean, look around you. Porn has hijacked our hunter-gatherer sexual drives and reshaped human sexuality in the 21st century, arguably reducing the quality of life of many in ways that they often hardly notice. Cell phones and social media eat up untold hours of our lives, making us angrier, snarkier, and meaner than we have ever been before. Gambling is now legal. Alcohol and tobacco are for sale on every corner. Cheeseburgers and French fries have left 3 out of 4 Americans overweight. Coffee is king. Most of us can't start our day without it. We're clearly a culture that embraces vice, a culture that doesn't mind addiction as long as it doesn't negatively impact the bigger social order. When we can make a profit off it, we often embed it seamlessly into our other institutions. And once that happens, the issues are minimized because we can deal with the issues when they arise. That is, as long as the person we're talking about wants to make a change. Regulating drugs doesn't encourage people to use heroin or to give up on life, but it does make sure that those people who might wind up in that boat anyway, that they're never alone in their journey, and that they always know where to go for help if they want it. It also gets rid of all illegal drug dealers overnight, which is a hell of a selling point in itself. But most importantly, it shows drug users how we feel about them, that they're people, worthy of being included in the social fabric and capable of becoming whoever they want to be. Again, that's the goal of this project. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce.
Once the habit is formed, the addict, taking his drugs in secret, must have a continual supply at all costs. But lawfully imported drugs are not available to him. He must turn to an illegal source. He must have his drugs several times a day or he suffers painfully. As he gets used to the drug, his need increases. And when he can no longer afford to supply himself, he tries a cure or pleads for a jail sentence.
If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.